Brendan Clarke-Smith. You were born on a council estate in Nottingham. How tough was your upbringing?
Well, I wouldn't say I had a tough upbringing necessarily. I had two very loving, caring, hardworking parents. The community I lived in always very supportive of each other. It's just one of those typical post-war estates, really. It was the biggest in Europe when it was built, very, very large in size. And a lot of people who'd moved there had moved from some of the poorer areas in Nottingham. So my dad was from an area called the Meadows. Nowadays you'll see it, and it's been associated with a lot of crime. There's a bit of gentrification going on nowadays, but yeah, they moved to that estate and they had indoor toilets and no tin bath in the yard, so it's quite a luxury at the time.
And your parents divorced when you are 12?
Yeah, I mean they weren't actually married, so that's again, it was a little unusual, I suppose, in the day at that point. But yeah, they separated, and I still had a lot of contact with both parents, which was great, and they're very supportive. But I suppose it wasn't really an easy age. I'd just started secondary school, and yeah, I'd be lying if I said it didn't affect me a little bit.
How did it affect you?
Well, I think for any child, I think when you're in an unfamiliar environment, I didn't go to the school that my friends went to, so that was already one big break for me. Parents going to live in different places and the contact, and it's kind of you do feel a little isolated and lonely at times, I suppose. I have a younger sister as well, which helped, but as I say, it's parents splitting up is never an easy thing.
You're the first in your family to go to university, so whatever challenges your childhood presented, it didn't stop you going to university. How did you find it?
It was a bit unusual, really, because I never really, I say I don't like students. That sounds terrible, really, as a teacher, but never felt like a student. I was always like a townie who was doing a degree, and it felt a little bit like that. So I went to Nottingham Trent, my local university, a little bit apprehensive about it. None of my friends really had gone to university. They're all trained as plumbers and electricians and that kind of thing. And yeah, I started it, and it was completely not what I expected, a lot more down to earth, and I studied politics, so you can decide whether that was useful or not.
So you didn't live on campus like lots of the other students, is that right?
That's right, yeah, I lived at home at the time, and I was the first year that the tuition fees came in as well, so that was quite useful, really. So I did that, and then I had a part-time job, so I was a steward at the football at Nottingham Forest and at Notts County, and my first job was washing dishes in a pub, so it's very much a local, really. Maybe not quite the same university experience that others had had, but certainly didn't hit me in the pocket as much as others.
Do you think the way that people experience university is a deterrent to lots of working class people, because it is very much based on like a private school model that you go and live in dorms and away from home? Do you think do you think we should embrace the experience of people living at home and going to university more? Do you think there's too much emphasis on moving away?
Yeah, I think it not only saves a lot of money, but I think certainly for me, I think if you look at some of the more elite, or whether it's Russell Group or whatever it is, and so on, and people go there and not necessarily familiar environments. You know, if I were in a dorm, or I'm sat on one of those big long tables, or wearing different robes and things to eat, I mean, I would have been like a complete fish out of water with that. So it very much felt like a bit more of a working class sort of feel to it when I went to university. So, and the biggest problem for me is there was nobody around me that had been to university before. So I didn't get that experience around at school. I didn't have it with friends. I didn't see it with family. And that's kind of the thing that we try and push now. And I was a school teacher, and we have all these open days now, and the universities are great. They do outreach work. And that's more the kind of thing I think we should be doing. It kind of shows that aspiration. It shows what you can do. And it's maybe not as unfamiliar to people, a little bit like careers in politics, I suppose.
And when was your political awakening? What was the moment that you thought, I'm a Conservative and I'm going to do this quite seriously?
Well, I was a bit unusual as a child. You know, I watched Spitting Image and The New Statesman and the original House of Cards and so on, and took quite an interest in that. I suppose when I grew up, Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister, and politics was very polarised then. And I suppose throughout life, I've always been very black and white about things. So for me, it was a sort of a natural thing for me. Didn't study politics until I did my degree. It's very difficult to find anywhere where it was available or you could do anything about it. I was looking at law, and then decided I was kind of more bothered about what I thought the law should be than what it actually is. So for me, politics, really, I got into it that way. I got elected as a councillor when I was 22 in my city in Nottingham. That was quite unexpected for the estate I came from. And I kind of did everything back to front, really. So became a councillor and then went into employment, my career in teaching a bit later, and then came full circle for Parliament.
So at university, were you a member of the Tories?
I was, yeah. I joined what was the, I think it was Conservative Future it was called at the time, and there's a very, very small group of people, probably only 4 or 5, and I think the chap running it had been running the Socialist Workers Group the year before, so he'd had quite a journey himself, I think, in that year. Wasn't really for me. I ended up as a last sort of roll of the dice. I thought, well, I'll look what my local association's like. I was probably the youngest person there by about 30 or 40 years. But it got me out leafleting on the streets, and that's really what got me into local politics. So it was a sort of a life-changing moment, really. So I was radicalised at university.
What year was it when you joined the Tories?
1998. So I'm in my 23rd year as a member now.
1998, the height of New Labour. Tony Blair's approval ratings stratospheric. You didn't see anything appealing in that government, which was incredibly popular at that time.
Yeah, I think because I'd always been looking at my own life and my parents say you buying your own house and all that aspirational side, I suppose was very naturally Thatcherite in many ways. For me, it seemed that was being brushed away, something new was coming along. I didn't really take to it very much, so my natural instinct was to rebel against it. I suppose really, being rebellious and being a conservative aren't necessarily two things that you put together, but that was kind of where I started from.
Tell us about your wife and how you met.
Oh, that's an interesting one. So as part of my teaching career, I decided to move abroad. I thought I fancied a bit of change, and I'd studied the European elections the year before. They're quite an expensive business election. So thought I'd do a bit of travelling, try and pay off a few debts, and a job came up in Romania, and that was probably my sort of sliding doors moment, really. So moved abroad, and at New Year, I'd gone out with some of my friends in one of the local expat places. We dressed up in all sort of different fancy dress. I think I'd gone as Maverick from Top Gun. And I saw this lady smiling across, and took to her very quickly and went across and asked for a number, and she said, "No, get lost." So a bit of Dutch courage and another couple of attempts. So, well, add me on Facebook maybe then. So she added me on Facebook, and then 6 months later we got married.
No.
Yeah, and the amount of times I've given people stick for getting married very quickly with people, and I've never been a settling down type or anything, but it really was a life-changing moment for me, quite literally.
Gosh, you must have said something really impressive on Facebook, given she didn't want to give you your number when you asked for it. How did that happen? 6 months?
Yeah, it was a bit of a whirlwind romance, I suppose. And my wife, she was working as an anaesthetist in Romania, and then we ended up.
She's Romanian. Yeah,
she's Romanian. Yeah, and we ended up moving to Norway together afterwards. And our son was born in Norway, so quite an international family in that sense. And then back to Romania, and then back to the UK, where we are now. So,
still fascinated by how you won her round from get lost to marriage in 6 months.
Yeah, I'd like to say my charm and charisma. I think Facebook, probably the fact a couple of hours later in a free bar probably had something to do with that, but we'll see.
So your wife is a doctor at Bassett Law Hospital. As you said, she's Romanian. Any prejudice that she's encountered while she's been here during the Brexit debate, subsequent to the Brexit debate, more generally?
Yeah, more generally in society, not at all, really. She's been welcomed as you would expect. She's had a lot of questions about Brexit, and as a Brexiteer myself, trying to explain the reason why we wanted to leave the EU. It's this idea that it's a hatred of foreigners or anything else. And I kind of try to explain about the idea about freedom and choices and so on. I think a lot of people, especially in Eastern Europe, understand that better than anybody. I think what they've been through themselves. I think my wife, a birth certificate is the Socialist Republic of Romania. And obviously Ceausescu was still in charge when she was born. And I think she certainly gets it. I think it took a bit of getting used to in the health systems here. It's very different. And culturally, that was quite a change. So, yeah, I think there's been a lot of challenges there. But, she's enjoying it now, and she'll hopefully be one of our new GPs in the next year.
Now, when you look at your Wikipedia page, there are some quotes which may or may not have been taken out of context, but just let me put a couple of them to you, because Wikipedia, as we know, is not a perfect source. So it says, he has described food banks as a political weapon, saying it is simply not true that people can't afford to buy food on a regular basis. Did you say that?
Yeah, I think the way it was taken out of context, I remember that at the time as a hustings. Now, when I was growing up, I grew up in places where people struggled along, not necessarily great incomes, and you had that wider support network with your families or in the community or churches and so on. And nowadays, society's changed a lot. And I think you're having food banks stepping in where you used to have that wider support network around you. So I've always been very much full of praise for people who volunteer for that. I worked in the voluntary sector myself for 3 years for a charity. So I kind of get that, and that there's an important part there that they play. My biggest problem is I felt it was kind of being politicized a little bit, and that, the numbers are increasing of food banks, and it was being used as a kind of a stick to beat us with about austerity and so on. So it was more about the politicization of it. I think coming from a working class background, and probably similar with the universal credit debate, we've seen people, we've lived next door to people who have either played the system or not necessarily be work when they could have done and so on. And I think we're probably a little bit harsher on that. I tended to find that people in those working class communities were probably more sympathetic to what I was saying than maybe more affluent areas.
You will get stick for saying that, as you have when you have made what some people would say provocative comments. How do you ever, when you get abuse on Twitter or wherever, does it ever make you stop and think, am I right? Because this is quite a barrage.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm one of these people who occasionally likes to stick my neck out with things. Some can say that's being a little populist or deliberately controversial. Been accused of making it as clickbait before, for example, that kind of thing. But I mean, these are all things that I do genuinely believe in. And I always say that, if you don't believe something, don't say it. So if I've said something, I will defend that. I don't apologize for it. I may elaborate on it, and I may say, well, okay, I appreciate the other person's argument. I think I've probably mentioned about things like taking the knee, where I've made comments as well. It's another area. So yeah, I will occasionally say things that people will disagree with, but I'll say at least this is where I stand on the issue, and I just want to be as honest and transparent as I can.
So when I would say things, I mean, it was probably the Brexit debate where I got the most abuse. Oh, and resigning from Jeremy Corbyn. So there's a couple of times when I've done what I sincerely thought was right, but the barrage is quite overwhelming. Doesn't bother you at all?
I'd be lying if I said it doesn't bother me a little. I mean, myself, I don't mind. I mean, people will say I'm just being a wind-up merchant or so on. I'm a fairly thick-skinned person from that perspective. It maybe crosses the line a bit, I think, when it starts being your family members are commented on. I had quite an unpleasant remark about my children and things like this. I mean, I only actually have one, but you get those kind of messages through from people, and I think my female colleagues have had far worse than me. So I wouldn't say that makes me feel better, but it makes me reflect that actually there's some pretty appalling stuff that members of Parliament get sent. And that's not to say that I think you should just tolerate it as part of the job, but at the same time, you do know that you are going to come in for that. If
you look at the Cabinet, you might think that you could well put a case that most of the most prominent figures are posh, really posh in some cases, very unlike the 2019 intake of Tory MPs. Does the future of the Tory party need to reflect the working class nature of us 2019 intake? Will that put the Tory party in better stead if your voices are promoted or seen at a top level of Tory party politics?
I think it's good that the intake generally, but the wider party reflects the country. And I think the great thing about having all the new Red Wall MPs and so on, you had more people who'd done kind of that more normal background, as we'd say, whether they're the teachers, the nurses or so on. But these people have always been there. And I think if you look at previous intakes, if you look hard enough, actually, we've always had this, but it's perhaps been brought more prominently. Perhaps because of the recent results. Yeah, I mean, if you look around the cabinets, they may sound a bit posher, I think, in parliamentary language, but there's some people, I mean, Priti Patel, very, very normal background. Parents came to the country as refugees and so on, and a lot of people who are very much self-made. So it's that idealism, that kind of natural conservatism that comes out. So, yeah, it would be nice to see some of my colleagues getting in the cabinet, but then there's other people in the intake, people who've been special advisors and so on, people who have been from all sorts of backgrounds, whether you're barristers or in finance as usual, but it's a good spread with everybody. And I think unless you get that mix, then really you're not representative of the country, the same as if you had an entirely working class cabinet, that wouldn't be representative. So it's about getting the mix, and I think we're certainly getting there.
So you've said that you don't mind the Twitter abuse or criticism. Has it ever become more than just social media abuse?
Yeah, I mean, I've not had anything physically to me, thankfully, or anything like that. Not like the female colleagues have had some appalling abuse, and I think they generally get the worst of it. I think where it crossed the line for me is when they start making comments about your family or threats and so on. And I think after I made the comment about taking the knee, I had one particularly unpleasant message that was sent to me. And it said basically about kneeling on my children's necks until they were dead because they wanted me to feel that pain. Now, I don't have children. I only have one child, and it's a keyboard warrior. But even so, I mean, I had to speak to my wife about that and kind of brief her beforehand, just to say, look, please don't get upset with this. Don't take it too personally. It's just idiots on a keyboard. It's not going to happen in real life, but I think sometimes people forget in terms of the security we have. My house, it's been fitted with panic alarms and new locks and everything. And my wife said, why are we getting these? And you tell some of the stories that colleagues have had. In my case, it was just a threat. The police dealt with it. They were great and so on. But it just does make you worry in future that something actually bad could happen. Did the police go and track down the person who sent you that message and speak to them in some way? They did, yes. So they managed to track down who it was. They went around there, they arrested the person, and then they were dealt with as a result of that. So the police are excellent, I have to say. They're fully understanding, they're very supportive, and they know that the troubles that members of parliament have with threats are actually real. Of course, we've lost MPs in the past as a result of that, and we don't want to see that happen again. But it is a real problem, I think, that we have to live with, and something that needs to be dealt with. This person, did they publicly post something on Twitter? Did they email you? Did they send you a direct? They directly emailed me. They directly emailed your parliamentary account. Yeah. So it was nothing to do with social media. They directly emailed you to tell you that. Did they live locally? No, they didn't. Thankfully, they lived somewhere else, a drivable distance, but not a constituent. I think if it had have been somebody locally, I think that would have been a little bit more concerning. You said they've been dealt with by the police, cautioned, that sort of thing. They were, yes, and I spoke to the police about it, and I think it was a first offence as well. But as I say, if you don't treat these things seriously, you never know. It only has to go wrong once. Brendan Clarke-Smith, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Gloria.